The old man's hands trembled as he pushed his worn mop across the cafeteria floor, and from across the room, 3 young recruits watched him with smirks spreading across their faces, not knowing that those same trembling hands had once held steady enough to save 17 lives in circumstances they couldn't begin to imagine. His name was Harold Mercer, and at 73 years old, he had spent the last 8 years working as a janitor at the very same military training facility where he had once been considered a legend, though that legend had long been forgotten, buried under decades of dust and faded photographs that nobody bothered to look at anymore. The recruits, Tyler, Marcus, and David, were in their early 20s, fresh-faced and full of the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, the kind of arrogance that mistakes potential for accomplishment. Tyler, the loudest of the 3, elbowed Marcus and nodded toward Harold, who was struggling to squeeze out his mop with arthritic fingers. "Look at him," Tyler whispered, loud enough for the old man to hear, shaking like a leaf. "My grandfather's got more steady hands, and he's been gone for 10 years. The 3 of them burst into laughter, and Harold paused for just a moment, his weathered face showing no reaction, his pale blue eyes fixed on the floor as he continued his work with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned long ago that words from small minds were like wind against a mountain. They made noise but changed nothing. Staff Sergeant Patricia Webb watched the exchange from the doorway, her jaw tightening with anger, but she held her tongue, knowing that Harold had specifically asked her years ago never to reveal his past to anyone. She had served under officers who had served under him, and the stories about Harold Hawkeye Mercer were the stuff of training manuals and whispered reverence, but Harold wanted none of it. He wanted only peace, only purpose, only to spend his final years in the place that had given his life meaning, even if it meant mopping floors and enduring the ignorance of children who thought they knew everything. That afternoon, the incident escalated in a way that would change everything. The recruits were on their lunch break when they noticed Harold sitting alone at a corner table, eating a simple sandwich, his eyes distant and thoughtful as he gazed out the window at the rifle range, where new trainees were practicing their marksmanship. David, trying to impress his friends, walked over and slid into the seat across from Harold, his smile predatory and condescending. "Hey there, old-timer," David said, leaning back in his chair. "We've been watching you around here. You ever actually serve, or were you always just cleaning up after real soldiers?" Harold's eyes slowly moved from the window to meet David's gaze, and for just a moment, something flickered there, not anger, not hurt, but something deeper, something that made David's smile falter for just a fraction of a second before he recovered his bravado. "I served," Harold said simply, his voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of 1,000 experiences David couldn't begin to understand. "Long time ago. Different world." Tyler and Marcus had wandered over, surrounding the table, their postures aggressive with the confidence of youth. "Yeah, right," Tyler scoffed. "Probably served food in the mess hall. Look at those hands. You couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with those tremors, old man." Harold looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly, as if seeing them for the first time in years. The tremors were from a condition that had developed a decade ago, his doctor had explained, but Harold knew the truth was more complicated. Some wounds weren't visible, and some battles never really ended. "My hands weren't always like this," Harold said quietly, almost to himself. "They used to be very still." Marcus, the quietest of the 3, felt something uncomfortable stir in his chest, something that whispered he was making a mistake. But peer pressure pushed the feeling aside. "Prove it then," Marcus challenged, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "There's an open range slot this afternoon. Officers sometimes let civilians take a few shots for demonstrations. If you think you were such a hot shot, let's see what you've got." Tyler's eyes lit up with cruel excitement. "Yeah, let's make it interesting. 5 targets, 5 shots. You miss even one, you have to wear a sign that says, "I was never a soldier," while you mop for a week. David and Tyler high-fived, laughing at their own cruelty, while Harold simply looked at them with an expression that was neither angry nor sad. It was something more like pity, and that look unsettled David more than he wanted to admit. "And if I don't miss?" Harold asked, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. The recruits exchanged glances, caught off guard by the question. They hadn't expected him to negotiate. They had expected him to back down, to make excuses, to give them the satisfaction of proving their assumptions correct. "If you don't miss," Tyler said slowly, clearly making it up as he went, "we single quotes, LL. I don't know. Polish your boots for a month." The laughter returned, but this time it was nervous, uncertain. "Not my boots," Harold said, and something in his eyes had changed. The distant, foggy look had cleared, replaced by a focus that seemed to sharpen the air around him. "If I don't miss, you'll listen. You'll sit down, and you'll listen to a story. That's all I want." The three recruits looked at each other, confused by this strange request, but they agreed readily, certain they were about to witness an embarrassing display that would provide entertainment for weeks. Word spread quickly through the facility, as it always does in places where days blend together and any break from routine becomes an event. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a small crowd had gathered at the outdoor rifle range. Other recruits, a few officers who had heard rumors, and Staff Sergeant Webb, who stood at the back with her arms crossed and a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had tried to warn the three recruits, had pulled them aside and suggested they apologize before this went any further. But Tyler had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "We're just having some fun, Sergeant. Old guy probably doesn't even remember how to hold a rifle." Patricia Webb had simply shaken her head and walked away, wondering if Harold would finally let his past speak for itself. The range officer, a younger man named Lieutenant Collins, who had only been at the facility for 2 years, looked confused when Harold approached and requested to use one of the precision rifles. "Sir, this is usually reserved for qualified personnel," he began. But Staff Sergeant Webb stepped forward and whispered something in his ear that made his eyes widen. He looked at Harold with new respect, then nodded slowly and retrieved the rifle himself. The weapon was a standard training rifle, well maintained and accurate. And as Harold took it in his hands, something extraordinary happened. His hands, which had trembled so badly when pushing that mop, grew still. Not completely. There was still the ghost of a shake, but it was as if the rifle had awakened something in him. Some muscle memory so deeply ingrained that it bypassed whatever condition had affected his nerves. The crowd fell silent. Even Tyler, Marcus, and David stopped their snickering, struck by the transformation they were witnessing. Harold's posture changed, his shoulders straightened, his breathing slowed, and his eyes took on a quality that the recruits had only ever seen in photographs of combat veterans. A 1,000-yard stare that somehow became laser-focused when he raised the rifle to his shoulder. The first target was set at standard distance, 50 meters. Harold didn't hesitate. He lifted the rifle, took one breath, and fired. The sound cracked across the range, and through the magnified screen that displayed the target, everyone could see the result. Dead center bullseye. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement. Harold simply adjusted his stance slightly and prepared for the second shot. The second target was at 75 meters. Again, he fired, and again, the bullet found the exact center of the target. A murmur went through the crowd. Tyler's smile had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like the beginning of fear. Not physical fear, but the fear of having made a terrible mistake. The third shot came at 100 meters, and as Harold took aim, a gust of wind swept across the range, the kind of variable that throws off even experienced marksmen. Harold paused, seemed to calculate something invisible in his mind, adjusted almost imperceptibly, and fired Bullseye. By now, Lieutenant Collins had pulled out his phone and was frantically searching for something. When he found it, his face went pale, and he began showing his screen to others nearby. The fourth target was set at 150 meters, a distance that challenged even the best trainees at the facility. Harold took slightly longer this time, his breathing becoming so controlled that his chest barely moved. When he fired, the silence that followed stretched for an eternity until the screen confirmed what everyone somehow already knew. Bullseye. The crowd was completely still. Marcus had turned away, unable to watch anymore, shame beginning to burn in his chest. David's hands were shaking, trembling the way Harold's had when he mopped floors, and he suddenly understood that those tremors had nothing to do with weakness. The fifth and final target was positioned at 200 meters, a distance typically reserved for advanced sniper training. Harold took his time. He closed his eyes for a moment, and those watching him closely saw his lips move silently, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a memory, perhaps words meant for someone who wasn't there anymore. Then he opened his eyes, raised the rifle, and in a motion so smooth it seemed choreographed, he fired. The screen flickered, displaying the target, and there it was, a fifth, perfect bullseye. Harold lowered the rifle and handed it back to Lieutenant Collins, without a word. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in stunned, reverent whispers. Staff Sergeant Webb was wiping tears from her eyes, and the three recruits who had started all of this stood frozen, their faces transformed by shock and the dawning realization that they had mocked something sacred without understanding it. Harold walked toward them, his hands trembling again now that the rifle was gone, and he sat down on a bench at the edge of the range. "You said you'd listen," he said simply, gesturing to the space beside him. Tyler, Marcus, and David sat down like chastised children, unable to meet his eyes. For a long moment, Harold was silent, gathering his thoughts, deciding where to begin a story he hadn't told in nearly a decade. 53 years ago, Harold finally said, his voice carrying just enough for the three young men to hear, "I was exactly where you are now, young, confident, convinced I knew everything worth knowing. I had been told I was a natural marksman, best in my class, they said, maybe the best they'd ever seen, and I believed them. I let that belief become arrogance, just like you three." Marcus swallowed hard, shame burning hotter in his chest. "I was deployed overseas," Harold continued, his eyes growing distant. "Won't burden you with the details. Let's just say things were different then, and the world was an uncertain place. My unit was sent to assist with a rescue operation. A group of medical workers, doctors and nurses, had become trapped by rising floodwaters during a monsoon season. The route to reach them was dangerous, and only a small team could make the journey." Harold paused, and his hands trembled more noticeably now. There were 17 of them. 17 people who had dedicated their lives to helping others, and they were stranded with supplies running out and weather closing in. I was the youngest in my squad, just 20 years old, but I was also the best shooter, and our commander needed someone who could cover the extraction from a distance in case anything went wrong. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was beginning to understand that this story was leading somewhere profound. "The extraction took 3 days, Harold said. 3 days of navigating terrain that fought us every step of the way. And when we finally reached them, when we finally started bringing those medical workers to safety, everything that could go wrong did. Equipment failed, weather worsened, vehicles got stuck, and I spent 37 hours in a position providing cover, making sure that when problems arose, I could signal for help. I could guide helicopters through visibility so poor that pilots couldn't see their own instruments." He held up his trembling hands and looked at them. "I didn't eat, didn't sleep, barely drank water. By the end, my hands were so cramped around that rifle that medics had to pry my fingers loose when it was over. They thought I might never have full function again, but I did eventually. The doctors said it was a miracle. He lowered his hands. We got all 17 of them out. Every single one. And I thought that would be the end of the story, that I'd become a hero and live happily ever after. But that's not how it works, boys. That's not how anything works. Harold's voice dropped lower. One of those medical workers, her name was Eleanor, she wrote me a letter after she got home safely. She thanked me for my service, for my sacrifice, and she told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "A steady hand means nothing without a steady heart." What you did required both. I kept that letter for years. Still have it, actually, folded up in my wallet. David finally found his voice. "Sir, why didn't anyone tell us who you were? Why didn't you say something when we were?" He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what they had done. Harold smiled, and there was no bitterness in it, only a gentle sadness and something that looked almost like peace. Because who I was doesn't matter. What I did was 50 years ago. The young man who held that rifle all night isn't the same person pushing a mop today. Time changes us all, and the trophies we earned in youth don't entitle us to respect in old age. Respect has to be earned fresh, every day, through how we treat people, especially people we think can't give us anything in return. He looked at each of them in turn. You three will become soldiers, maybe good ones, maybe great ones. But greatness isn't measured in bullseyes or medals. It's measured in moments. The moment you choose to help someone who can't help you back. The moment you stand up for someone everyone else is looking down on. The moment you realize that every single person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Marcus was crying now, tears streaming silently down his face. He thought about his grandfather, who had passed away 2 years ago. A quiet man who never talked about his own service. And Marcus suddenly understood that silence differently. "I'm sorry," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, sir." "I didn't. I know you didn't," Harold interrupted gently. "That's why I wanted you to listen, so that next time, with someone else, you might think twice. You might wonder about the story you can't see before you write your own version of it." Over the weeks that followed, something changed at the training facility. It started small. Tyler, Marcus, and David began eating lunch with Harold, listening to his stories, learning about not just his missions, but his life. His struggles with adjusting to civilian life, the quiet grief of outliving friends he had served beside, the small joys he found in simple work, done well. They helped him when his hands made tasks difficult. They defended him when new recruits made the same mistakes they once had. And they became, in a way that surprised them all, a kind of family. Staff Sergeant Webb officially requested that Harold be recognized for his service during a facility ceremony, and when Harold walked across that stage to accept the long-overdue medal, his hands trembling but his head held high, every recruit in attendance stood and saluted, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood now what it truly meant to honor someone. Lieutenant Collins arranged for Harold's story to be included in training materials. Not as a tale of marksmanship, but as a lesson in humility and perception. And the 3 young men who had once mocked an old man with a mop became officers who were known throughout their careers for one distinctive trait. They never, ever judged anyone by what they saw on the surface. Years later, when Tyler stood in front of his own group of recruits, he would tell them about Harold, about that day at the range, about the 5 bullseyes that hadn't just hit targets, but had pierced the armor of his own arrogance. "The greatest soldier I ever knew," Tyler would say, his voice thick with emotion, "was a man everyone else saw as just a janitor. And if you take nothing else from your time here, take this. The people you think are the least important might be the ones with the most to teach you. Watch, listen, and never bet against someone just because their hands tremble. Because those hands might have held steady through storms you can't imagine, and they might just remind you who you're supposed to become." Harold passed away peacefully at the age of 81, surrounded by 3 young men who had become the sons he never had. and in his hand was a folded letter, yellowed with age, that read, "A steady hand means nothing without a steady heart. What you did required both." And in the end, what he had done was not just save 17 lives on a distant mission decades ago. It was save 3 young hearts from the prison of their own arrogance. And in doing so, he had changed the trajectory of more lives than anyone could count. That is the true measure of a soldier. That is the true measure of a human being. And that is something that no amount of trembling can ever take away.